A young elephant named Luna lay chained in the mud, while her mother Maggie watched helplessly behind the rusted fences of a forgotten roadside zoo. The owner, Frank Delaney, a former circus trainer, refused to let them go, seeing them not as lives, but as property. But Maggie wasn't just waiting. She was planning a quiet rebellion that would change everything. And what happened next turned this fight for freedom into a story of justice you won't forget. The sun bore down mercilessly on a forgotten stretch of Arizona highway, where an old roadside zoo stood hidden behind faded signs and overgrown fences. The tourists had long stopped coming. The cages hadn't been cleaned in weeks. But inside the rusting barriers, life still moved, slowly, painfully. A small herd of elephants remained. Once performers, they now stood motionless in the heat, swaying from foot to foot in what experts call a sign of psychological distress. Dust clung to their skin, and their ribs were faintly visible under the folds of dry, cracked hide. At the center of the herd was Maggie, the eldest, a towering figure with eyes that had seen too much. Her body told stories, worn tusks, a stiff leg from an old untreated injury, and a large patch on her flank where hair no longer grew. But it was her gaze that made volunteers fall silent, deep, alert, and undeniably aware. For 10 years, Maggie had watched others come and go, trainers, caretakers, even other elephants. She had seen calves taken away, cages rearranged, food reduced. But now, her world had grown quieter and harsher. The youngest of the herd, Luna, barely 2 years old, was born into this place of decline. She stumbled more than she walked. Each attempt to lie down ended in her being pulled upright with ropes or sticks, while tired workers muttered instructions with indifference. Her cries were soft, barely more than a breath, but Maggie heard every one. What once echoed with music and crowds now rotted in silence. The zoo had officially closed its gates a year earlier due to health code violations, but the animals had never been moved. The paperwork was complicated. No one followed up. That is, until Emily Carson arrived. Emily, a local wildlife rescuer with a background in environmental law, had heard rumors. Neighbors had reported strange noises, emaciated animals, and chains clinking after dark. So she sent up a drone. The footage it captured was grainy, but unmistakable. Luna sunk to her knees in a muddy pen, a chain tight around one leg. Maggie pressed to the gate nearby, trying to reach her with her trunk. Emily uploaded the clip that same evening. By morning, it had exploded. Thousands of people watched in disbelief. The video spread from animal rights forums to major news platforms. Hashtags trended. Celebrities retweeted. The public reaction was visceral. Outrage, heartbreak, and a growing sense of urgency. People demanded action. Where were the authorities? Why were these animals still there? Soon, journalists arrived at the zoo. Local activists organized peaceful protests. Donation campaigns to relocate the elephants raised thousands in hours. And yet, behind the chain-link fence, nothing changed. Because inside, sitting in a plastic lawn chair under a broken awning, was Frank Delaney. A former circus trainer turned zoo owner, Frank had built the roadside attraction decades ago. In its prime, it had been his pride. Now, it was his last grip on relevance and control. The animals to him weren't beings. They were investments, assets, property. He watched the reporters from a distance, arms folded, eyes narrowed. "They're mine," he muttered. "Nobody steals from me." Instead of cooperating, Frank reinforced the gates. He added new chains. A "no trespassing" sign went up in bold red. When officials called, he delayed, citing legal technicalities. Emily and her team tried reasoning, negotiating, even offering private relocation assistance. But Frank wouldn't budge. His fear of losing control outweighed his concern for the lives behind his walls. So the protests grew. The media pressure intensified. And inside, the elephants waited. Maggie didn't know what would come next. But she felt it, a change in the air. And as night fell, she stood guard near Luna, as she always did, gently swaying with the rhythm of distant thunder. The standoff had begun, and somewhere deep in Maggie's chest, the quiet fire of instinct began to rise. For days, tension hung in the air like static. The protests outside grew louder. Donations poured in. Authorities promised they were reviewing options. But inside the zoo's cracked concrete walls, nothing moved. Except Maggie's mind. She had been watching, listening, learning. The zookeepers no longer paid attention the way they used to. The night staff had been reduced to one man covering 3 enclosures. The wooden partition at the rear of her pen had rotted from years of neglect, and the summer winds were shifting. Maggie was ready. That night, the sky above the Arizona desert turned the color of old ash. A dry wind picked up dust and leaves, whispering of a coming storm. The heat had not broken, but the pressure had. Somewhere deep in the clouds, thunder rolled. Inside her pen, Maggie stood silently. She touched trunks briefly with Luna, then with the others. Charlie, an anxious bull in his teens, and June, a quiet female with a limp. Each responded with a low rumble. And then, without hesitation, Maggie turned toward the old divider. She braced her massive shoulder and pushed. The wood cracked, once, twice, and then it gave way. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough for the lone overnight worker, stationed in a trailer out back, to panic. At exactly 12:37 a.m., Emily Carson's phone rang. The voice on the other end was shaky. "One of the elephants. I think she's trying to break out." Emily didn't hesitate. Within minutes, she and 2 volunteers were in the truck, racing toward the compound. Lightning flashed on the horizon. The desert was awake. When they arrived, what they saw stopped them cold. Down the slope behind the compound, in the moonlit wash of a long dried creek bed, moved 4 enormous shapes, slow, deliberate, and silent. Maggie was at the front. Her body shielded Luna, who stumbled occasionally but kept going. The herd didn't scatter. They followed. Emily's heart pounded. "They're not running," she whispered. "They're escaping, together." It was then that she remembered the temporary corridor, a fenced path built weeks ago in preparation for a relocation that never happened. It was unfinished, but intact. With no time to lose, Emily and her team sprinted to the gate and pulled it wide. Maggie hesitated at the entrance. The headlights of Emily's truck lit her broad face. For a moment, she stared directly into the beam, unmoving. Then, she stepped forward, trunk gently brushing Luna's side, as the others followed her into the corridor. And then came the shouting. A truck pulled up fast behind them, brakes squealing, gravel spraying. Frank Delaney jumped out, rage written across his face, a long metal object in his hands. Not aimed, but raised. "You let them out," he shouted. "You think you can just take them?" His voice echoed in the dry night, loud and cracking like the thunder above. Emily turned, heart pounding, and took a step between him and the elephants. Her voice was calm, dangerously calm. "Frank," she said, "you pull that trigger, and the whole world will see who you really are." Silence, the kind that holds its breath. Maggie stood still behind Emily, her frame casting a massive silhouette against the storm-lit sky. Luna pressed close to her side, trembling. Frank stared at them, at Emily, at Maggie, at the cameras on the protest trucks already filming from the road. And then he dropped the barrel to the ground. A single breath of wind swept through the wash, and with it, a moment of stillness. Emily didn't speak again. She just turned and walked with the elephants, guiding them toward the trucks that had been waiting for a call that never came. Until now. That night, under desert thunder and moonlight, Maggie led her family away. Not in panic, not in chaos, but in purpose. 2 months later, the air smelled different, fresh, green, alive. In a Tennessee sanctuary far from the dust and heat of Arizona, Maggie stood tall among her herd. Around her, open fields, the soft rustle of leaves, and the calm flow of clean water. Not the silence of neglect, but the peace of freedom. Each elephant had changed. They moved with confidence, not caution. They played. They rested. Luna, once too weak to stand, now sprinted through the grass, chasing butterflies and kicking up dust. This wasn't just survival, it was healing. Even Frank Delaney changed. Sentenced to a year of community service at a wildlife rehab center, he started cold and withdrawn. But during his first week, he saw a video, Maggie leading her herd to freedom. He watched it in silence. Later, a staff member heard him murmur, "I didn't know they remembered everything." Emily Carson, reflecting on the moment, wrote, "Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's what makes justice whole." Maggie never went back to captivity. She became the quiet soul of the sanctuary. Visitors fell silent in her presence, not because she demanded it, but because she didn't have to. She had already spoken, in action, in courage, in the way she never stopped protecting those she loved. And when she raised her trunk in greeting, people didn't just see an elephant. They saw a survivor, a leader, a symbol of hope. Because triumph doesn't always roar. Sometimes it moves quietly and leaves the world changed behind it.